Hello, you lovely people. Welcome back to Sabbatical Stories. I'm your host, Bex Thomas, and I'm coming to you today from Manly in Sydney. I'd therefore like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Gairmagal people. I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. I set up this podcast to inspire courage and normalise taking a break from your career, and I would love it if you could help too by subscribing, liking and rating the show. It really would mean a lot. Today I'm joined by Santosh, an engineer turned artist, born in India but currently based in Melbourne. After 13 years in consulting, he has decided to take a sabbatical to pursue his passion for art. We chat about how something that began as a hobby, painting souvenirs from his travels, evolved into more, and what really was the tipping point for taking the plunge and gifting himself a break. That and much, much more.
Deep down, you've tried, dig deep, search wide, enjoy your climb, it's all for you.
Good morning, Santosh, and welcome to Sabbatical Stories.
Good morning, Bex, and thanks for having me here. It was very interesting how our paths crossed recently, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share my story.
Yeah, the wonderful world of LinkedIn and the professional network, huh?
Absolutely.
And look, as it is exactly that, your story, who better to introduce yourself than you? So can you give us a little bit of an intro to Santosh and your sabbatical story, please?
Sure can. My name is Santosh Mahale. I'm an engineer by educational background and a management consultant by profession. So I was born and brought up in Bangalore, India. And since then have been sort of a global citizen, having lived in the US, South Africa, Spain, Dubai, and then finally calling Melbourne, Australia my home for the last 7 years. Regarding my sabbatical story, slightly different. I mean, it comes with the same intent and purpose that many of the stories you've shared, but different in a sense that it was not sort of a career crisis or break or burnout that made me go on a sabbatical, but instead it was to give time to execute on my passion and my passion for oil painting, something that I had picked up and done for over 20 years, but was more a hobby for years. And, there was a chance here for me to take it beyond a hobby. And when we talk more, I'll share how I used this sabbatical to not only do my first solo art show internationally, but then also sort of establish my art style and practice in the process.
Amazing. And 20 years you've had this hobby. What initiated the hobby? Where did, being an engineer by trade and going into management consulting, where did the hobby come from?
Yes, interestingly, and this sort of connects you because that happened in London. So this was 2008. I was living in San Francisco. I was visiting on a long trip to London because my brother was living there. At some point, perhaps after visiting many of those tourist places, and a thought came in, that perhaps I should paint a version of London for myself. And so I came back to San Fran, and in those days I was renting. So, small house, small walls. So I further constrained myself to a small canvas, right? And I tried to capture London on a single canvas. And what started there is almost like a souvenir for myself, then became like almost every travel would end up with a painting. And that went on for years. So the style and subject were more or less getting set until, obviously, life happens. I had geographic moves, as I had mentioned. I had a son, a pet, and, doing oil paintings meant, it's not the safest space to do these things around with kids and pets. And so I gave a bit of a break, and then COVID happened, right? And I think, where I'm going with this, that the time, especially for us as management consultants, suddenly came out of nowhere. And I'd settled down in Melbourne, got my own house, bigger walls, asking for art. And so sort of that's, where it sort of went to some extent beyond a hobby.
And so does that lead into the timing of the sabbatical? So COVID happened, you picked up the hobby and sort of delved further into it. Why take the sabbatical now? What was the sort of timing relationship in that?
It happened organically, right? So it was obviously, now COVID is already 5 years back. And I refer back to this book called Tipping Point. I don't know if you've heard by Malcolm Gladwell. And what I noticed in my own practice was that, I was getting to a point where I could see that this could be more than a hobby, right? This was something, for years it was my family, friends, people who came home for dinner, seeing my artwork at home, saying, great job. You should have thought about being an artist. And I'm like, oh, right. What a starving artist is. And it was the point post COVID where I think the amount of artwork I did, the consistency I developed in my practice meant that I could sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm like, this can be something more. As you know very well, as consultants, we barely have time to even do anything beyond our work. And on the other side, art is more than a full-time job. In fact, as consultants, we all work hard. And even in my life, I've had many instances where I had to put all the effort to achieve something. But I have the utmost respect for artists because the amount of time and energy it takes to first do the art and then realize that it's just the start, right? You've got to do everything else to sort of ensure that it's sold or, it shares the message you want to deliver. So I think the tipping point together with this time constraint meant that, I had two choices. I could let it linger on as a hobby and perhaps, do it as I wanted, or perhaps take it a bit further and actually give it the due respect and time that it deserved, right? And I think that's where my mind sort of shifted. And I was like, I didn't call it a sabbatical then, to be honest. I was like, I just need time. And I think it manifested again organically in a sense that first, my firm Carney was extremely supportive to give me a part-time role. So I went 4 days. So I was not working Mondays. As a male in his 40s, it was not so common, but I think I was given all the support to both at home from my wife as well as Carney to pursue that. And now that certainly gave me time to do more. And I had my first solo art show in Melbourne, right? Which was, again, touchwood, went very well. I received, a greater audience beyond the friends and family network. And that, again, led me to that next crossroad, right? So what next? Am I going to be this guy who would exhibit once in 3 years in Melbourne, or do I want to do more? And that's when, I always wanted to do something in my hometown of Bangalore. And I said, okay, you know what? How about going international and not a group show? I want to do a solo show. It's a little bit about how my art style is. And I wanted to sort of cement my art style and my approach to art, right? And the subject. So that's really where this thought of the sabbatical came, because there was no way I was going to pull something like that without a break.
Without the time.
Yes.
I've seen your art. It's amazing. I absolutely love it. And it's so unique. And all of the ways of following you and getting in touch will be in the show notes. But how would you describe your art style?
I've been told many things. And I personally also, because I was not trained in art, right? I had, 3 degrees, 2 in engineering, 1 as an MBA, but never nothing, even a course in artwork. But the best one that I've heard, and what I sort of relate and believe as well, is like, it's a version of consulting on canvas, right? And the way I'd explain this is, as management consultants, we are brought in completely without any experience in that particular industry, perhaps. And we boil the ocean to do all the research and everything, and then try to present back the case to the exec on a single slide. If I go back to my art, I'm essentially, when I travel to a place or a place I've lived in, I'm absorbing, doing the research, trying to identify all these interesting stories, not something that you just heard or what is more common, and then coming to try and capture all of it in one canvas, right? So you can paint London in 10 or 100 canvases, but to bring it all in one is in some sense, a problem, right? And then I'm solving this problem artistically because it still needs to be visual. It needs to have the composition, color, tonal values and whatnot to look like an art. So that's perhaps the best way I've heard. And I love it because, truly, I thought I was made to be a consultant, or I was, like I'd say, born to be a consultant, and I love my art as much. So it's not like I can choose one over the other.
So it's a combination. It almost brings the two together, right?
Yes.
And with regards to the timing, and then obviously having to ask, once you've decided, no, you want to take it internationally and therefore you need more time, how did you actually go about asking your company for the time off? And, I think our audience would be super interested in how you navigated that, how you sort of planned for that and what the conversation and process looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Bex, we were fortunate that as management consultants, sabbatical is not something that's abnormal, right? It's not normalized perhaps like it should be, but even in my career of 10 years with Kani, I have seen juniors go on multiple sabbaticals just in a span of a couple of years. So I think the concept itself is not alien. But having said that, there are few things obviously that work in our favor, right? So firstly, we work in cycles of projects and being on a break or a beach to do BD. So the timing, you always have an opportunity to ask. We don't have any BAU commitments, which mean that we don't need to worry about, as long as we're not going during a peak season or when there's a shortage in staffing, we can have a clean cutoff as to when we want to leave and join. And then I think the one that perhaps is not shared as much is that as management consultants, we are designing our exits, right? So it's normal for a management consultant after working a couple of years to say, what's next? And this is a very open conversation you have, and often be it going back to the industry, doing a startup, joining a public sector. So it's a very normal thing for consultants to take the time. And I think what better than having a sabbatical, because then you're giving the necessary time and thought it needs to make that life decision, right? So I think to answer your point, I think the concept itself was normal. For me, I think the question was more on time, right? And I'll share about this a little later as well. But I think, as consultants or as individuals who want to take sabbatical, we need to keep that patience. Sometimes it doesn't happen when you want. So just because you want to go do it now, it doesn't mean you can be on a plane tomorrow. And I think having that patience only helps. So in my case, it was almost a year before I approached my mentor for the sabbatical. And once I approached, it was almost a year that it took for me to get the sabbatical, right? And if I look back now, that year only helped me to, further establish myself, and I could hit the ground running when I actually started, right? So yes, I think, so my story, or for those of us who are in consulting, I think, luckily for us, our jobs are designed in a way to take this and run the marathon.
It's such a perfect point, isn't it, around it almost being designed for an industry, and the message being that anybody can do it. It's around navigating, as you say, sort of the time and working through how that actually happens. And so obviously you did art, but what has your break looked like to this point? Because I think, what have you got, 2 or 3 months left?
Yes, I'm almost at the tail end
of your sabbatical. How long was it, or is it? And how have you spent, your first part of that break?
So in total, it was about 8 months. So it's really 6 months of sabbatical. And then I had some leave that I accumulated to consolidate together. My sabbatical broadly, went with 3 main intentions, right? And 2 of them were short term, right? So the first one, as I mentioned before, my international solo exhibition was in Bangalore. I just finished end of last year. So that was sort of the first marker. And it was almost like 4 months after the start of my sabbatical. Together with this, there was also this, as part of doing the show, I was doing a lot of things related to the art practice, right? Setting up my style, website, social media, whatnot. And I think for me, till this milestone was crossed, it was all heads down. It was more than a full-time job, right? So as you can imagine, to do that exhibition, do everything myself. I was not doing it with a gallery or a third-party support. I was just, I was making those trips to India. I took all my artwork there, did all the marketing, and it was, touch wood, a very successful show. I got 60% of my artwork sold, and then a lot of other prints and whatnot. So I think, for the first 4 months, time just flew, and I didn't even think I was on a sabbatical. Now, the second part of the sabbatical, which is where I'm in now, is more the reflection, what you call preparing for the integration sort of phase. And here I'm trying to find the balance, right? And the first balance for me was the family. Like, as you can imagine, being a management consultant and then having this crazy hobby of doing art meant, certainly something was compromised, and the family time and the time I usually spend was certainly impacted in the last year, right? So I wanted to normalize that as much as I could. And then to extend beyond that, bring that balance to the whole life, or ikigai, right? So yes, I love my consulting. I love problem solving. This is the kind of, I want to be a consultant for life. And at the same time, I love my art, and I love to travel. I found a way to bring all of these together. Now I need to, as the ikigai concept goes, I need to find a way to sustain this, right? And so now my problem has become suddenly, I think I have realized what makes me happy and what I want to do. Now I just need to solve the problem of how do I sustain it. And so I'm hoping in the last 2 months, and with the help of, now that I have exposure to your podcast and the frameworks your audience has been sharing, I'm hoping I learn a couple of things to help me bring that balance beyond my art and family into my whole life.
And it's a really interesting point, the balance, isn't it? Because I think the word is thrown around so much. And for me, it comes down to almost reframing what your own version of balance looks like. I know that for me personally, my old story was that I had to be balanced always, like consistently balanced. And actually, what I've probably over 5 years found that is what I now, or how I now measure balance, is actually over 365 days. Because what I love is the travel. I have, amazing people that I love on two sides of the world. So if I'm in Australia, the balance with spending time with my nieces or seeing my mum and dad or communicating with, friends in Europe is compromised. It is, like, just because of location and time differences and all of the things. But actually, if I can look over 365 days and go, actually, I feel balanced over that time. I feel like my cup is full and that all of my priorities I have juggled and balanced, and I feel comfortable with that. That's my version of balance. Whereas other people do want it to be consistent throughout this routine life of within their work and hobbies and family. And so I think it comes down to kind of defining what balance is to you and over what sort of time you measure that, and then working through that to the next chapter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for me, I was a bit like you and was looking at my cup at the end of the year, right? Saying, you know what, I've done these 3 family trips and I've done this, and now I've spent all my week in art and it's balanced. But my wife had a different opinion, right? She was like, no, I needed to be present every day. It can't be that you just go for 2 months for an art show and then, so I think sustaining it is hard. It's not easy. And once again, having this sabbatical is truly a time for you to prototype, to try, if what's working, and you never know till you try. So I'm still finding, I don't think I'm there.
And you make a really good point around considerations of others, because there's one thing to be selfish and only look after our own cup, but actually that's not the reality, right? There is, if we're in relationships, if we've got family, if we, our career, everything, it is around that ripple effect and really considering those others. I remember my husband and I, when we started to look at what we wanted the next chapter to look like, oh my goodness, we'd never sat down and truly kind of put it onto paper of what it looked like. And they were so different. And so then you have this, holy crap, like how are we actually going to make this work? And there is compromises that take place. Did you have any sort of preconceived notions or myths or expectations about your sabbatical, and how have they been challenged or surpassed during the experience?
Yes, I've been reflecting about this, more recently. Like I said, till I had my solo exhibition, there was no time to think. It again relates to time, Bex, right? So we all know, and we've been told enough times, we spend a good amount of our lives working, more than home with family or vacations. We are spending a good 40, 50, 60 hours, depending on the industry you are at work. When you're starting a sabbatical, you have this notion, or at least I had, that, wow, I've got so much time. And as productive and as individuals like we are, as consultants, we go making those lists, right? So here I was like, wow, I'm not going to be working at all. Like I can do this. And you sometimes make that sort of an unrealistic set of things you think you can achieve. The art, I'm lucky, everything went as planned. I achieved or sort of overachieved on that dimension. But I also had a long list of other things of, okay, maybe I could travel and with family, and maybe I could do all these DIY stuff at home, and maybe I could do something else. And guess what, Bex, time flies. And you think an 8-hour day sitting at home, especially when doing something like art, goes even faster. So that was, I think, perhaps something I'd like to encourage everyone, just to be realistic and not put unnecessary pressure on yourself. And it's okay to do lists, but then it's okay not to achieve everything as well. As long as you achieve the main purpose why you took the break, and also be careful not to overpromise. So in this case, I definitely overpromised my wife a couple of home projects that I would do, and I'm clearly behind on those.
Oh, I love it. I think with regards to just going back to your point around time and balance and home projects that might not get done or might get done, it also begs the question, doesn't it, of whether we can lace sabbaticals and career breaks throughout, once you've taken one, whether you can lace it throughout life to actually try and find that balance. And Tim Ferriss talks about taking a mini retirement every 5 years, and he's talked about that for 20 years. I know that, Gen X now are, or Gen Z, I can't remember which generation it is, are really talking about mini retirements, and every sort of year, 2 years or 3 years are taking 3 months or 6 months off work to explore and do things. You mentioned around the consulting industry actually almost being set up for it. So whether that is something that actually you then start to lace them through, and it's like, well, okay, this project didn't get done on this sabbatical, but maybe in 2 years' time or whatever, I can take another sabbatical and ensure that project, sorry, wife, gets done. Gets done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and it's wonderful what you're doing as well, Bex, here to improve the awareness. I think all of us have the intent, especially here in Australia. I think there's a willingness. I think the support is there. It's just not normal. I think more people take it, the more normal it becomes. I know a lot of things have been reversed post-COVID. I thought things would be normal. Like, for example, even me doing part-time as a male and not for child support, suddenly became normal post-COVID, right? It was, it was unheard of before, right? And I hope in a few years, as these become more normal, people are encouraged to take, and then they have the support needed with people like yourselves to ensure that it's successful, right? Because only if you have your first successful sabbatical that your wife or boss or anyone else is letting you go on the next one. So
your 4-day-a-week piece, did you have to apply for that, or how did you sort of, navigate that with the company?
Again, I was very fortunate from a timing perspective. It was just post-COVID. We were coming back to the normal, and people were coming back in various forms, right? So many people left as well. So I think I at that time when I requested for my sabbatical, it was sort of, additional support was given to employees. And I think I sort of was lucky in that sense. And then I was supported. And I think the other aspect there is that, when I actually went to a 4-day-a-week schedule, I was already a consultant for like a good 6-7 years. So I and that's key as well, because you can't do it if you're new in a firm or new in a profession, right? So for me, it was almost like I could be planned, I could be structured, and I could make it work. Because they say, in consulting, we don't even have boundaries around the day. So how does putting a time limit or being part-time even work?
But you have that demonstrated background and history. So it really makes the conversation easier, doesn't it? Around
Absolutely.
The fact that you are delivering, you can be trusted to deliver, and therefore that conversation is so much easier. We've talked about time a lot, and one burning question I have, and I'm sure it's probably not easy to answer, how long does a piece of art take you?
A long, long time. So I'm very detailed. As I said, very detailed oriented. It's almost like you need to pull the canvas off, as they say, for me to stop. But I do largely two kinds of styles. So I do my map series where I have the road layout and whatnot. And sometimes those go up to like 150, 200 hours each. And those are of big cities. I start my stopwatch from the time I start thinking, right? So for me, the research that is outside the canvas is as interesting as when I hold the paintbrush to paint, right? And it's like, I've now got to put this city, be it Melbourne, on a canvas. And there's so many things going on in Melbourne. How does it all fit? The composition needs to make sense. What would be the colors that represent Melbourne? And, what gets in, what gets out? And, so there's so much of thinking as much as then, saying, now it's all clear. Now I'll spend a good, 30, 40 hours in drawing it all. And then the painting comes in, right? So, I wouldn't say all of it is just sitting down and thinking, but across while I'm traveling, jogging, or doing other things, I'm constantly thinking, what's next and how do I bring this artwork to life?
And what else does the research part of the process look like? Is it purely just sat down thinking, or do you go out and wander the streets? Do you actually go online and do research? Like, what does that look like?
Oh, it's always, physical, right? So I think I would never paint a place. So there's perhaps, maybe there's an exception if it's a commission, but even then I would normally not. I've always experienced the place first.
Okay.
And that's like you say, I love doing those morning walks, like you said, you had a friend who talked about it. But yeah, so I love doing that, getting lost. And then I use those travels, or even if I'm staying in Melbourne, experiencing a suburb, I start capturing those patterns or things that actually make that place unique, right? And I think by virtue of actually living, it's just not when you visit, you get a sense of a place, but nothing like actually living in a place. And because I've actually lived in multiple cities across the world, I think somehow subconsciously, the moment you put me somewhere, I just start absorbing. I'm like, oh, you know what? A, B, C things are similar and D, E, F are different. This one stands out. The windows are of a particular style. They seem to be using these kind of tiled roofs. And I just can't help it, but I just start absorbing. And I'm like, so that's the first step, right? And obviously some places get me more curious than others. And I'm like, I have to paint this place. And then the research, the online and book research starts, right? So I would go to the library, pick some books, or I would just go wandering on the internet and seeing what's interesting and why. Is there a story? Like, why is the architectural style this way? Or, why are the roads like this? Or even the birds, because you may have noticed, there's always a bird. So that's my signature. So you will see, because birds are there in every city in the world.
Oh, I love it.
No matter how crowded, polluted, noisy, busy, or empty a place is, there's always a bird. And it's a different bird, right? So there's a certain species of bird in London, and there's a certain species of bird that's found home in Sydney. And perhaps, even in Melbourne, it's not there. Like, we don't have as many bin chickens as you have at the Bay, right? So there is, they're almost like another marker for a city for me. And because my art style brings the bird's eye perspective, it fits very beautifully when I have a couple of birds sort of looking at the painting or looking at the city. And then I also call my exhibition series the bird's eye. So like I had a bird's eye Melbourne, which was my first exhibition. And then the one recently was called Bird's Eye Bangalore. So it just helps me connect. And perhaps again, that's a consulting thing. We try to, connect everything and try to connect the dots and try to bring a story into everything.
I love it. And I've seen some of the birds, but I'm now going to look out every single time on yours for the bird. What's been the most unexpected part of the journey to this point?
Positively, I think for me, the most unexpected was that I didn't think that my exhibition in Bangalore would be as successful as it went, right? And, I knew I'd worked hard and I put everything I had, but I think it all sort of came together in a very beautiful way. And I was amazed to see the kind of support that comes from old networks, like the schoolmates that I'd not seen for 30 years and, my old sports mates. So I think, I want to say for me, it was a positive surprise. And what I hope to encourage through my story is a sabbatical doesn't need to be for just the conventional things, be it because you want a break or you want to travel, or, it could just be for a safe space to try out something you've never done. If I had not taken the break, I would have not, exhibited back home in India. And if I had not done it, perhaps I would not know that I have so much support in a market that's beyond my current home in Melbourne. So nothing sort of, from a negative side or a surprise, but I think it was a positive surprise for me in terms of how dedicating and putting 110% into something that you're passionate about can really help you.
And what a beautiful part of the journey. And it comes back to that you don't know what you don't know. If you don't do something, as you say, you would never know how much support comes from those old networks. And what's the one thing you would do differently if you were to rewind the clock 5-6 months? Is there, on reflection, anything you would do differently?
Well, I would at least do one home project first before I
manage your wife's expectations better.
Yes. But just jokes apart, I think I feel like maybe the disappointments I've had is when, like I said, I probably overpromised myself or assumed I was a superhuman being able to do all of this. So I think it's perhaps one thing I would do is do everything I did, but then also just be realistic that, there would be some of it would would not be possible, and that's okay too.
It's such an interesting one, isn't it? And especially because we almost become wired and have this kind of maybe even addiction to actually Amanda, who kicked off series 2, she talks about her stories around burnout and real, her body made her take a break. And she talks through the actual learning to do nothing and being this A-type personality, and she was in a tech startup and this very sort of pressurized, and also was putting pressure on herself to write a book and do all of these sports at a certain level and literally unsustainable. But she talks about then learning to do nothing and actually learning to be able to sit on a park bench in a park and not do anything and not write a list and not read and going through she calls it a dopamine detox. And I've become really interested in it. I'm not brave enough to do it yet. I think it would be super hard, but I wonder whether there's something to be said about kicking off that, intentional piece of time with 2 or 3 days of nothing and a dopamine detox, or I don't know, it could be something that somebody tries.
I had a reflection just as you said that. Right now, we talked a lot about the sabbatical I'm currently on, but technically, I had my first sabbatical about in 2018 when I moved from Dubai to Melbourne. So essentially, I was still with Kani, and my wife got a job here, and I sort of followed, was transferring offices. And interestingly, I never looked at it as a sabbatical. It was really a visa break. So I needed a visa to work in Australia, and as you know, the paperwork takes time. Now, my wife was a Kiwi, so I was obviously allowed to come here, live with my family, but not allowed to work, not even at McDonald's, right? So at that time, my son was 2 years old, so no oil paints allowed at home. So no painting. And, talking about the park bench, I probably went and sat in hundreds of parks in Melbourne. And luckily we have enough to have kept me busy. And I think there was something to it, perhaps. And in my case, maybe that break, which I didn't call it a sabbatical, was probably key in letting me be a consultant for this long. Right? Because perhaps, I would have not done it if, perhaps my visa had come within a day. I would have been on that first project here in Melbourne. But because I had that forced break, and, I was not upset because I was experiencing this beautiful city of Melbourne. I'd seen it for the first time. I was getting lost every day in the suburbs, and I was enjoying it, right? But at the same time, I would have probably not done it if my visa had come, or at that point I was doing art like I'm doing now. It is. And I think, so sometimes when life throws us those breaks, we should just take it and reflect on it, that, it just helps us run this marathon.
Yeah, it's so true. And look, Santosh, I always end the podcast with asking guests what your top 3 tips would be for anybody thinking about taking a sabbatical or a break or about to embark on one.
Oh, sure, Bex. This was my favorite part of your show. I used to just wait for them at the podcast. So firstly, I think a lot has been talked about intent and purpose in your podcast, but I want to underline that further and say that it's also important that anyone going on a sabbatical must have articulated some clear milestones and goals. And ideally, these milestones should be spread across the duration of the sabbatical. Now, the reason I say this is, as I mentioned, time flies, and time flies even faster when you're on a sabbatical, right? And having these milestone means that you are on a mission, and your identity is not about the sabbatical; it's about that mission, right? So if you ask me anything before my show ended in December, I was not even thinking about whether I was in a sabbatical or not. It was like I needed 40 hours to just get through everything I had to, right? So completely mission driven, very positive, and that sort of momentum helped me sort of achieve many other goals which I never set out as well. Right. And the other related reason why this becomes a top tip is all it takes is one question that for you to go into this self-doubt or negative spiral and whatnot. Right. So having these goals and, ideally across your sabbatical means, you're just moving from one mission to another. And it could be anything. It could be travel as well. I wanted to travel these 3 places for these reasons, and I finished one. Now I'm planning the next and so forth. Right. So that's my top one. The second one I mentioned, I think patience is a virtue, but even more so in a sabbatical. A lot of your guests have talked about just go do it. And I think that's fine. but then you don't need to do it tomorrow, and sometimes, if you have to wait because your company or your boss wants that support, just be open and flexible, and it only comes back, right? I think the year delay that happened in my sabbatical only helped me overachieve on some of the goals that I had set. And then lastly, I would say, as humans, we always see the grass is greener on the other side. So use the sabbatical as a safe space and go sit on the grass on the other side, right? So, and you might not like it. You might say, oh God, being an artist full time is the worst thing I could do, and that's okay. You can use this time to test it, prototype it, and then come back and design the balance you want, right? So those are my top three.
I love it, because we always talk, don't we, about watering your own grass first and but actually, who's to say you can't just pop across and sit on somebody else's grass for 3 months, 6 months and see what it's like, exactly. And come back to your own grass. I love it.
And I hope I have, not just inspired consultants, as we've talked about, our industry is designed to have sabbaticals, but I hope I've also inspired some aspiring creatives. Go try what you want, and we're lucky here in Australia, and this sort of a concept is normalizing the world over. So make use of it, and you'll never know unless you try. So
thank you so much, Santosh. And if anybody wants to follow your art or buy some of your art, where can they find you?
So I do have a website, which is my name, santoshmahale.com, which I hope you can share through the notes. And also my Instagram handle is santoshmahale.art. As I said, I'm still very much a consultant as well. So I've got my LinkedIn profile as well with my name. So yeah, all those ways are open, and message me or reach out, and happy to have a chat.
Wonderful. And yes, I'll put all of those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me. What a wonderful discussion, and look forward to keeping in touch and seeing what, going back to consulting looks like for you.
Absolutely. And thanks Bex for this. Thank you.
Thanks, Santosh. You take care.
You too.
Let's try to keep this real. And it's like she said, we're all affected, yeah. And it's like he said, I won't let it out, turn the other cheek, show that.
Thanks so much for listening. I really do appreciate each and every one of you taking the time to join us. Thanks so much to Santosh for his inspiring story of taking a break to pursue his artistic flair. For all information and for the links to Santosh's shows and website, everything will be in the show notes. Thank you to Auntie B at the Flaxen, my incredible, patient and talented producer. And also a special shout out to the very talented Joanna Cook, whose soulful blend of smooth vocals we're lucky enough to use throughout the show. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you could like and rate the show, and even leave a positive comment if you want to make my day. Also, if you think a friend will like the episode, please do buzz it over to them. Your support means so much, and spreading the word helps even more. Hey, do you have a sabbatical story to share? Or maybe know someone whose journey would inspire others? Do let me know. You can get in touch via Sabbatical Stories Podcast on Instagram, or message me on LinkedIn. I'm Bex Thomas. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep dreaming big, and remember, your sabbatical story is waiting to be written.
Turn the other cheek, show them your smile. You won't believe things for a while. Taking matters into your own hands, you won't believe that you're making